A nation born from an idea. Built by millions of hands. Torn apart, and rebuilt again. This is the story of America. 250 years, compressed into 12 minutes. Long before Europeans ever set foot here, millions of indigenous peoples called this vast land home. The Iroquois. The Cherokee. The Sioux. The Navajo. The Apache. The Lakota. Hundreds of nations, each with their own complex governments, distinct languages, and rich spiritual traditions, stretching back thousands of years before any European ship ever touched these shores. They farmed the valleys, built trade networks spanning the continent, raised cities along great rivers, and developed intricate systems of governance long before the word America ever existed. Some built confederacies that balanced power. Others thrived through trade routes stretching thousands of miles across mountains, deserts, and plains. Then, in 1492, a single voyage changed everything. Christopher Columbus's arrival opened the door to European colonization and set in motion centuries of conflict, exchange, disease, and upheaval that would reshape the continent forever. It began with Jamestown in 1607, a fragile settlement that barely survived its first brutal winters, plagued by starvation and disease. Then Plymouth in 1620, where a small band of pilgrims sought religious freedom, relying entirely on the help of native peoples simply to survive. Slowly, 13 colonies took root along the East Coast, growing under British rule. Each developed its own economy, culture, and identity. From the merchant ports of the north to the sprawling plantations of the south. But that growth came at a devastating human cost. Beginning in 1619, enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to these shores in chains, stripped of their names, their languages, their families, and their freedom. Their labor, generation after generation, built much of the wealth that colonial America would come to depend on. It was a foundation of suffering hidden beneath the promise of a new world. By the 1770s, tensions between the colonies and the British Crown were boiling over. Taxes on tea, paper, and everyday goods sparked outrage among colonists who had no voice in Parliament, no say in the laws that governed their daily lives. Taxation without representation became more than a grievance, it became a rallying cry that united colonies that had once seen themselves as entirely separate. In 1776, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. The Declaration of Independence was signed, declaring that 13 colonies dared to call themselves a free and independent nation, staking everything on an idea that had never before been tested at this scale. Years of brutal war followed, freezing winters at Valley Forge, desperate battles fought with dwindling supplies, and uncertain loyalties that split families and communities apart. And in 1783, against all odds, that fledgling nation won its independence from the most powerful empire on earth, a victory few thought possible. In 1787, delegates met once more, this time in a sweltering Philadelphia summer, to draft the Constitution, a framework of government built on checks and balances, compromise, and hard-won consensus, a document that still stands as the law of the land today. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States, stepping into a role with no precedent, no blueprint, and the weight of an entire experiment resting on his shoulders. But as the young nation found its footing, it also began pushing relentlessly westward, clearing forests, building settlements, and often violently displacing the native nations who had lived on this land for countless generations, breaking treaties almost as quickly as they were signed. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the country overnight, a sweeping deal with France that opened vast new frontiers. Manifest destiny took hold. The belief that America was destined by fate to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, whatever the human cost. Settlers pushed further into the continent, drawn by land and opportunity, while explorers like Lewis and Clark charted territory that had never appeared on any American map. But beneath that growth, a fault line was deepening, one that no amount of expansion could paper over. The question of slavery split the nation in two, cutting straight to the heart of the American experiment, threatening to tear apart everything the founders had built just decades before. In 1861, that fault line finally broke. War erupted between North and South, brother against brother, sometimes literally dividing families across battle lines, a nation violently divided against itself. For brutal years of fighting followed, reshaping the landscape of the country and the lives of nearly everyone in it. Roughly 620,000 lives were lost, more American deaths than in any war before or since, a scale of loss that touched nearly every family in the country. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation declared enslaved people in Confederate states free, a defining turning point in the moral direction of the war. And in 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery nationwide, for good, closing one of the darkest chapters in the nation's history, even as its wounds, and the deep inequalities it left behind, would take generations to heal. The late 1800s brought sweeping transformation across every corner of American life. Railroads stretched across the continent, connecting coast to coast, shrinking a vast country into something newly navigable in days instead of months. Factories rose in every major city, powered by steam and steel, and waves of immigrants arrived from Europe and beyond in search of a better life, drawn by the promise of opportunity. They crowded into tenements in cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston. Skylines rose with the first skyscrapers the world had ever seen. Fortunes were made in steel, oil, and railroads, creating a new class of industrial titans whose wealth rivaled that of kings. But behind that glittering progress, workers, including children as young as 6 or 7, faced brutal, dangerous conditions in mines, mills, and factories, often working 12 or 14-hour days for meager pay, sparking a labor movement that would fight for decades for fair wages and basic dignity. And across the South, Jim Crow laws entrenched racial segregation into the fabric of daily life, enforcing a rigid system of inequality that would persist for nearly a century. The 20th century transformed America into a global force unlike any the world had seen before. It fought in 2 devastating world wars, sending millions of its young men overseas to fight in trenches and on beaches far from home. It endured the crushing poverty of the Great Depression, when breadlines stretched for city blocks, banks collapsed overnight, and an entire generation learned to survive with almost nothing, reshaping the nation's relationship with government and security. And by the end of World War II, America emerged as a global superpower, its factories retooled, its economy roaring, its influence stretching across every continent. It was a status sealed, in part, by a decision still fiercely debated to this day, the dropping of the atomic bomb, an act that ended one war but opened a new and terrifying chapter in human history, shadowed by the threat of nuclear conflict. The mid-20th century brought a long-overdue reckoning. The civil rights movement rose up across the country, led by courageous figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, John Lewis, and countless others whose names history never recorded, demanding that America finally confront its deepest injustices. Marches, boycotts, sit-ins, and acts of quiet courage forced a nation to look at itself honestly, often at great personal cost. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became landmark laws that reshaped the nation's legal landscape, dismantling decades of legalized discrimination. But the struggle for true equality was far from over. The Cold War cast a long shadow over the second half of the century, a tense, decades-long standoff between superpowers. Yet, the moon landing in 1969 gave the nation a rare moment of pure, unified wonder, as the entire world watched an American astronaut take humanity's first steps on another world. The tragedy of September 11, 2001, brought unimaginable grief and forever changed how the nation saw its place in the world. And the rise of a digital age would connect and divide the country in ways never seen before, reshaping how Americans worked, communicated, and understood one another. America grew more diverse, more connected, and, in many ways, more divided, a nation still wrestling with the same fundamental questions of freedom, equality, and identity that it was born asking 250 years ago. Every generation has added its own chapter of struggle, of progress, of setback, and of hard-won change, building on the ones that came before, often without fully resolving the tensions they inherited. Through war and peace, through prosperity and hardship, the story of America has never been simple, and it has never been finished. It is a story still being argued over, still being fought for, still being reimagined by each new generation that inherits it.